If you haven't done so already, you can check out my Turbo Dial deck profile, video linked up in the card above or down in the description below. That video provides important context for what this video will be about, so I do recommend checking it out before watching this one. Now that I've had a chance to go check that out, if you are going to, let's get right into this video, which will be discussing and trying to answer the question of, is the Turbo Dial deck good enough to bring to a tournament? Now that statement is very broad to try to assign statistics to, but due to the nature of the deck just trying to get into the Chrono Dial and taking that as the win condition, or because you can naturally should be able to extend into a win condition by getting into it, it makes it a lot easier to assign probability and calculate the likelihood of being able to establish that Chrono Dial. That being said though, it doesn't perfectly account for every single factor, which I will discuss some of it at the end of the video and throughout this video as well. So I will highlight when there are anecdotal assumptions made based off of my play experience or just factors that weren't captured when I was setting up the framework for this analysis that I realized through testing and running this experiment. So kind of set the groundwork for how I was defining consistency for this deck is simply, can I get into Chrono Dial within my first 2 turns? The reason why I chose to cut it off at the first 2 turns is, well, one, I can only add in so much complexity before it just becomes a pain and just takes way too long to try to figure this out. I was just trying to capture the overhead stuff to get us as good of a baseline as what was realistic with my time and capabilities. So anecdotally, I was finding that if I wasn't establishing the Chrono Dial within my first 2 turns, most of the time I was losing after that. I was just at too low spirits to really be able to do anything. So I either wouldn't get into the Chrono Dial or just be at too low spirits to properly set it up. So thus, that's an easy first capture, is that if I get to turn 5 or more, or my turn 3 or more, that automatically is counted as a failure. Won't always be the case in practice, but in general, I am fine making that assumption here to at least get a baseline. Important, take this with a grain of salt, as an approximation, not a definite number. The second factor to determine this, of course, is whether I'm going first or second, because that dictates how many cards in my opening hand I will see, as well as the number of cards I'll see by that turn 3, turn 4. So hence why I do have these 2 columns here, first and second, to keep track of that and that nuance there. And also just to be able to properly track number of games, I did set up 2 rows here to properly account for it in the calculations. Because the third thing I factored into this is opponent's response, because there are some very common cards the opponent can have that will interrupt my ability to get into the Chrono Dial. That being Gorgon's Gaze, that's the primary one, self-explanatory. Nexus onto whatever Elestral I'm trying to send a Chrono Dial to. My opponent flips on Gorgon's Gaze. I'm stuck. I can't do anything. The second answer it potentially is EQ, because if I have a body established, my deck is centered around protecting it from battle, but if my opponent, say, EQs my Plucky, I need a Tadpuff in hand or else I'm not getting it until turn 5 or more. So that was the second reason to factor in going first or going second, because I can directly calculate the probability of my opponent having an EQ or a Gorgon's Gaze. And since I'm calculating more for the competitive landscape and tournaments, I feel pretty confident about tracking both GG and EQ, because they most likely will be in most decks I will compete throughout a tournament, thus giving us a really solid baseline for this calculation. Though this doesn't fully capture all the different scenarios here, because there are a few combinations that I can have that also dictate how I interact with my opponent's answers, mainly with the Elestrals I have established on board and in hand. And this is where you see these row 15 through 17, where I have turn 3/4 with Plucky/Neblio, turn 3/4 with Tadpuff, or with 2 bodies. Because if I just have a Plucky or a Neblio established, my opponent can EQ them, my opponent can Gorgon's Gaze them, and then they've properly answered it, thus it is a failure, by my definition. If I have a Tadpuff in hand, only Gorgon's Gaze works here. And if I have 2 bodies, then my opponent needs some combination of EQ or Gorgon's Gaze. This is where I didn't factor in a specific nuance that will cause this metric to cause a bit more error in this metric. When I made the 2 bodies category, I was thinking specifically Plucky or Neblio on board plus a Tadpuff in hand, and thus my opponent needs 2 responses, whether it be to Gorgon's Gaze or Gorgon's Gaze in EQ, which I can calculate the odds of them having that and thus count as a failure. What this category didn't account for, but I did end up looping in there, was if I have 2 Tadpuffs in hand. And in that scenario, my opponent actually needs 2 Gorgon's Gaze. So in there, that means this metric is overinflated on failure because there's actually, I counted it as a higher odd of my opponent having it to answer 2 Tadpuff when the actual probability of them having 2 Gorgon's Gaze is much lower than Gorgon's Gaze and or EQ. The second thing it doesn't capture is what if I have 3 Tadpuff in hand? What if I have 3 Tadpuff in hand and a body on board? What if I have a body on board and 2 Tadpuff in hand? In those scenarios, my opponent would need 3 answers, which isn't accounted for here. I did bundle those scenarios into the 2 bodies because I did have 2 bodies and it's the closest I could get. And for those answers, it does mean that this metric is a bit higher than it probably should be, because those scenarios would end up being successes, or the failure percentage for this metric would mean that it is greater than that, because I'm counting those scenarios as failures when they should be successes. But at the same time, those scenarios come up far less frequently for me to believe the error should be great enough to warrant breaking out into its own categories and thus trying to redo this experiment to factor them in. And especially since we didn't calculate in double Tadpuff, which should be the greater sway to this metric, it should about even out, so it's not a huge degree of error, which I am still personally comfortable with. So small error there, anticipate that as well. So this is how I ended up with this chart here to calculate success. I keep track of the games going first and going second, where I hit the scenarios of hitting turn 1, Chrono Dial turn 1, Chrono Dial turn 2, Chrono Dial turn 3/4 with Plucky or Neblio, turn 3/4 with Tadpuff, or turn 3/4 with 2 bodies, or turn 5+ or a misplay. I did calculate my misplays to give us a better idea of the degree of error as well, because that did happen, and I did want to include those in because that also can happen. So I think it's a fair thing to throw in here. And since we're taking this all with a grain of salt, still feels appropriate. So now with the framework and definitions out of the way, before I get into actually discussing the results, I want to say that if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more Elestrals content. Any support is always very much appreciated. But getting into the results, from here, I just tracked the games that I ran test hands for. Since I was calculating for standard answers, I didn't have to worry about actually facing off against an opponent. I could just run test hands and see how quickly I got to the Chrono Dial, and then just run the percentage because I know the percentage of them having these common answers. So again, making some assumptions here. Some decks might be running like Laurels, which can out some of the, like the Plucky or Neblio potentially, or just other removal cards like Kinleo. So it's, again, just a baseline here, but that was good enough for me to be able to just run test hands to get it. So from there, I just ended up flipping a coin to decide if I was going first or second. Ideally, I could just run 25 games going first, 25 games going second, but where's the fun in that? And then I marked exactly what scenario played out when I ran the test hand. And then there, I just kind of calculate each of them in their own separate columns and then summed them up for the final calculation here. So what were the results? Out of 50 games, I succeeded in getting to my Chrono Dial 76% of the time, which is really good, with 24% of the time not getting into. Now note, this is getting into my Chrono Dial before checking if my opponent had an answer or not. When I factored that in, it ended up in about a 51.7% success rate. And that's simply because I can factor in my opponent a certain percentage of time having those answers, thus bring down that success rate significantly. So only about half the time it leaned to a success without getting interrupted. Sure, there's some error accounted for here, but I don't anticipate that error bringing this up more than to 60% and any lower than like 40%. And that's a very gracious margin of error. So that's not very great, especially since this still doesn't calculate stuff after the Chrono Dial gets established, which we'll get to at the end of this video. But the next interesting part about this data is when I look at the going first versus going second. So going first, I had a 60% success rate and a 40% failure rate, ultimately resulting in a success rate when I factor in EQ and GG of 40.8%. So that's very not good. That's under 50%. So going first, I'm statistically not likely to be able to reach my Chronodile by turn 2. However, on the other hand, going second, I ended up having a success rate of 92% on being able to get out the Chrono, or find the cards to get out the Chronodile, with only an 8% chance of not getting it out. Even those are situations where I misplayed. So there's a chance that this could be near close to 100, which is kind of crazy to think about. Just the extra card really helping out. But when we factor in the opponent having answers, it comes out to 62.7%. Definitely way better than everything else, but still, going into a tournament, do you want 6 out of 10 games win? That's still not likely going to get you in top cut. Not great regardless. But what this data tells me is, in terms of getting into the Chronodile, it is actually optimal to blind second. That extra card really helps you get that extra consistency, even through common answers such as Gorgon's Gaze and EQ. The probability of that extra card getting to you the pieces that you need to assemble it is greater than the risk of now guaranteed giving your opponent a chance to find those sorts of answers, which to me is very fascinating. But again, even with blind seconding, I don't think it's very worth it. Like, it's interesting because most decks do choose to go first, so the chances of you running into a blind second deck in this meta doesn't seem to be very likely, but even then, it's still not that great. And furthermore, what this calculation and this whole experiment fails to account for is your opponent's ways to answer the Chronodile once you have it established on board. The success rate of that is a lot harder to calculate, thus why I haven't done it here, but it's not going to end up being that whole 62.7% of the time. Your opponent's going to find out, so you're not going to have your answers for it. And that brings us down significantly. So ultimately, off of this baseline, what it factors in, what it doesn't factor in, and what I believe the degree of error is likely for this calculation, I don't actually think this deck is competitively worth it. Unfortunately, it's a really neat deck, but also probably for the best. If it's competitively worth it, it might be a bit frustrating. But either way, even if this deck had a bit more outs or not a bit more outs, but was a bit better, a bit more consistent, there are some glaring weaknesses for this deck that, now that I think about it, I don't know if I fully covered in my deck profile, so let's go over it here anyway. And the big one is burn. Your opponent can just ignore your Chronodile and go over the top with burn. You're using a ton of spirits, so it's not that preposterous to think that they can just burn you out of the game. Other common decks that I found that hard counter this one that you need specific answers for are Earth Beatdown. As long as, if you're in attack position, they can scale pretty easily with Demeters to be able to beat over your Chronodile, and especially if they're playing Altar, they can just switch you to attack position anyway. So yeah, I do think that even if this deck ended up being worth it, there are some pretty strong counters out there that ultimately would keep this in check anyway. So ultimately, this is a very fascinating exploration of such a strange and unorthodox deck overall. So I hope you found this as interesting as I did. I don't expect to do many of these videos. This is very much a unique case, but who knows, maybe something will come up in the future. But now I want to hear from you all. What are your thoughts on the Turbodile deck and these odds statistics that I have pulled together? Just final comment I can think of is I'm hoping that a deck core like this might be more relevant in the future when we've got a better payoff or the meta shifts somehow to better allow it, and we kind of have this baseline to work with. I think that would be very, very interesting. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. With all that being said though, look forward to more Elestrals content coming out real soon.